You're listening to Be the Exception podcast, episode 169. Today we are talking all things data collection. We have Timothy from Action Driven Data here to share with us some strategies for special education teachers to make sure that they're collecting not only the right data, but how to analyze it and use it all year long. He also talks about what kind of accommodations can be used for a variety of different learners and how to make sure that we're building that collaboration between general education teachers and special education teachers to make sure that we are providing support for our learners to have the best and successful year in our classrooms. So let's go ahead and jump on in to today's episode.
Welcome to Be the Exception podcast. As teachers, each one of us has something that comes naturally to us that others would love to know more about. Throughout this podcast, we'll chat with amazing professionals and offer easily digestible tips that you can quickly implement in your classroom or business, helping you stand out with things you do really well. Your host, Dawn Ellis, is a qualified educational specialist with 10 years of special education experience, published journal articles, and was a state finalist for Elementary Teacher of the Year. Dawn provides tools for special education teachers to perform at their very best, helping deal with the frustrating daily obstacles of being an educator. She offers a roadmap of resources and strategies to make you a confident leader in your school and community. So if you're ready to start the conversation, learn from others, and grow together, you're in the right place. Now here's your host, Dawn Ellis.
Well, hey there, and welcome to another episode of Be the Exception podcast. My name is Dawn Ellis. I'm the host of this show, and I am so glad you are here. Before we hop into today's podcast episode with a very special guest, I wanted to let you know that as the back to school season is beginning to ramp up, there are products for you in the TPT shop to help you save so much time, but there's also a brand new webinar to help you plan out your year for success, to help you with your journey as a special educator. In addition, there is a brand new special education collective for special ed teachers that is available for you to have for monthly training, downloads for special ed, different templates, as well as activities for math, reading, science, and social studies. It is available right now. You can check it out on my website, The Exceptional Collective. You can find it over at Cultivating Exceptional Minds. It's really a place where special educators can find the resources, the trainings that they need to quickly implement them into their classrooms. I would love for you to come and join in. Check out the training first if that's something that you want to learn more about with planning out your whole year of what to teach in special education classrooms. I will link it in the show notes, but come be a part of the collective. Now, I can't wait for you to hear our episode today, so let's go ahead and jump on in. Hey everyone, today we have Timothy from Action Driven Education here to chat with us all things accommodation and collaboration between general ed teachers and special ed teachers to make sure that we're providing the supports that we can for our learners to have the best success in our classroom. So help me welcome Timothy. Hey there, how are you?
Hi, it's good to be with you, Dawn, and all your audience as well. I enjoy your podcast and everything you're working to do to empower an effective education for all children. That's our mission, and I can see that you're working to achieve that as well. So thank you, and thank you to all your audience as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you are here and excited to learn from you the next several minutes about this topic. And I feel like it's definitely something that you're passionate about, and it's definitely built into this. You've made this dream a reality in different avenues that you've created. So I'd love to just pick your brain the next few minutes about this topic. But before we dive into that, just give our audience a little bit of background of who you are and the journey you've had in special education.
Absolutely. So I'm one of the older teachers, I guess you can say, in the profession, although none of us really ever want to admit that, except for when it matters for the experiences that we can speak to. I've actually spent 23 years working as a special education teacher, also as an administrator, a curriculum coordinator, a principal, and a director of special education. So across all of those roles, I've been privileged to serve children with special needs in so many different ways, as well as the teachers that are working to serve them. And to me, that's the biggest job out there. And to step out of that role and into my new company, Action Driven Education, to actually try to serve those teachers, to help them to find ways to make inclusion work for children with special needs. It literally comes from those days of my work as a teacher and an administrator, where I noticed that the teachers just kind of needed support. They needed ideas. They needed an opportunity to collaborate, and as well as some guides in terms of how to do that. So across the last 4 years now, I've been working to make that a reality. And that's been a real pleasure working with teachers across the country, helping them to find ways to make inclusion work for their children.
That's amazing. And all the different roles that you've had, I feel like it gives you such a wide spectrum of knowledge and insight of how inclusion can work and how it looks on a variety of different classrooms, maybe not just one particular one. So you probably have a lot of like do's and don'ts that you could share.
Oh, for sure. I worked in a small school for a while, and one of my jobs at the time was a slash role where I was the director of curriculum and special education at the same time. I like to call that my Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde job, because curriculum and special ed just don't always seem to get along real well. And that's honestly kind of where some of the problems come with general education teachers and special education teachers. Sometimes when you get into that, it feels like conflict. It really isn't. It just boils down to gen ed teachers have the expectation to teach a curriculum. And special education teachers tend to focus more on, but how can we make it right for the individual or for the child? And that conflict of accommodations, modifications, those adaptations that we do, it tends to change curriculum sometimes, change the way we teach sometimes, and then that tends to cause some of that conflict. So that's the role that I do go back to a lot when you talk about do's and don'ts, is that slash role where I literally had to play both sides of the fence, and it helped me to kind of understand a little bit better sometimes where that conflict can come from.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes too, the difference between the two roles plays a part of like general ed teachers are given a lot of times a scope and sequence and curriculum and told like, do this on this day and teach these skills. Whereas special ed teachers write this individualized plan and they're like, these are all the deficit areas that we need to focus on, but don't really necessarily always have a curriculum or a scope and sequence, and so there's that difference as well.
Right.
But I'm really interested to hear today just kind of how to help bridge that gap and build that collaboration and that sense of like camaraderie to help make the child the best version of themselves during the year that they are in our classroom. So let's just start off with talking about what is an accommodation and what is a modification. Can you break that down for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Before I break them down, let me tell you one thing that we really work to help general and special education teachers to understand, and that is the function of both of them. The function of both accommodations and modifications, we like to say, is to support the child around their need. That is such an important word, that little word around. If you start using that with general education teachers, then they get a realization that what they're trying to do is basically minimize the impact of the need by supporting the child around it. I remember hearing as a special education teacher, teachers say things like, well, how is that accommodation or whatever helping them to become a better reader? And the answer is, it's not likely doing that. What it is doing is supporting them around the need so that they can learn science or social studies, right? So by helping that gen ed teachers to realize that you want to teach a child social studies, so there's a need that's presenting a barrier. What do? We support them around that need through the use of an accommodation or modification. Now, the difference between the two in my world goes like this. Accommodations simply change the how. How are we teaching? How are we testing? How are we permitting this child to engage in this activity we're doing, whatever. It's the how part of instruction. Modifications change the what. And when I talk about what, I'm talking about my former job, the curriculum, right? So when you talk about a modification, you're changing what the child learns. Now, I also want to add one little element to that, which is to say, it's my position that accommodations can and should be used for any child that's struggling, which means maybe in a pre-referral setting, like an MTSS thing, or just a student that for some reason today is struggling. An accommodation is something that is allowable in my world for any child. A modification, on the other hand, is kind of limited to the child that has an IEP with an identified disability. That's that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde side of me saying, look, if there's no reason to change the curriculum, meaning that the child doesn't have a disability, then let's let the curriculum roll. But if the child does have a disability and you need to change something about what they're learning, then you use a modification. So accommodations are the how and modifications are the what.
I love it. Yeah, that's definitely how I feel like I see it in my head too. Just accommodations are so easy to like change them out. Like this didn't work today, let's try this one tomorrow. But that modification is where you're like changing the instruction or the mode in which you teach a skill, because there may be some soft skills that need to be mastered a little bit before in order to find fluency in the skill versus frustration. Because I feel like the end goal between both teachers is for the student not to hit frustration all the time, and to build that confidence. So now that we know what accommodations and modifications are, how do you recommend going about selecting the correct accommodations? And even what are some of your favorite accommodations to use with learners? And it probably, as I ask that question, it probably depends on the disability category. Let's just go with OHI, ADHD. What are some of your favorite accommodations?
Oh, and you said a lot there in that question. So let me break that down into a couple of different pieces. So to get started, when you talk about selecting the perfect accommodation, I like to use the book Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? So when Goldilocks walked into the house, one bowl of porridge was too hot and one bowl of porridge was too cold and one was just right. And that's based on Goldilocks, right? So Papa Bear liked things certain ways and Mama Bear liked things in other ways, and Goldilocks liked it another way. And that's kind of the way I look at accommodations, right? There are literally hundreds and hundreds of different accommodations that we might select to use, but we need to remember that we're trying to find just right. The one that's right for that child, the same as Goldilocks was trying to find the bed that was just right for her, right? So when we talk about finding just right, on our website, we talk about using three variables: strengths, needs, and degree of need. Okay, strengths make sense. And again, if you don't know a lot about this, feel free to visit our website to learn more, or we can talk about it maybe in the future about that.
Absolutely.
Needs, you mentioned ADHD, right? So that's an example that we can run with. And then we talk about degree of need. Now that's the data, right? That's the how needy is this child's need, right? And that's why we pay so much attention to the data at the beginning of the IEP, the present levels of functioning. Why do we do that? So that we can select the just right accommodation. Now, one other piece that I want to lay into this, and this goes back to that collaboration piece that we're going to talk about. And that is, in some teacher's classroom, the child may not be demonstrating a need, right? They may be doing just fine. And if they're doing just fine, then what that teacher has already developed in their classroom is already just right. So don't touch it. It's well within the law to say that an accommodation should be used in only a certain classroom based on the need the child is demonstrating in that classroom. So when we talk about selecting a just right accommodation, we're really talking about paying attention to three things. Number one, their strengths. Number two, the need, ADHD, whatever. And number three, the degree of need. That's that data And that degree of need may vary from classroom to classroom based on the practices that general education teacher is already using in their room. So selecting just right, there's your equation, right?
Okay.
Now, as far as favorite, I'm going to give a little bit of a cop-out answer to this, but I'm going to answer the question, because that's actually exactly why I stepped out of the classroom and into a role as a business owner, I guess you can say, with action-driven education. Because what we noticed was that teachers, especially special education teachers, when we're busy, we tend to reuse accommodations over and over again. So I tend to not throw out accommodation ideas, because what I know is then people tend to write that down and say, oh, I'll use that. And next thing you know, you're using it for 15 kids. Well, just right isn't just right for 15 kids. Just right is that for that individual. So what we did was we developed a system that we call Accommodations. And Accommodations has hundreds and hundreds of detailed accommodations in it that are designed to help that teacher, general education teacher and special education teacher, find that just right accommodation. That way, instead of me sitting here saying 3 accommodations right now, I'm going to tell you I have hundreds of them there that you can go and find the one that's just right, versus writing down 2 that you'll reuse. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So that's available on actiondriveneducation.com, right? And that's for
Yes,
teachers.
that's correct. Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about some action steps that special education teachers can take to make sure that we are empowering ourselves and general ed teachers to make sure that we have the right accommodations and that we're implementing the things that we put in place.
That's a really good question. And I honestly, that's probably the perfect question with respect to how to make inclusion work, because finding that just right level of support means that we start in what's going on in the classroom already. So in other words, we don't say this is what worked down the hall or whatever. We look at the teacher's classroom where the kid is struggling. Look, I look at it like this. We're special education people. We specialize in the individual. So we need to think of that word when we're also thinking about the gen ed teacher that we're collaborating with. That person is an individual. They have practices that they're using in their classroom already. They have certain ways that they like to teach and methodologies that they use, right? So by thinking about that teacher as an individual, that's the first step in what I would call an action sequence, right? Recognize the individuality of that teacher's classroom. So then we go in and we look and we start to see, oh, wow, they're doing so many different things already for all of the class. We call these whole group accommodations, right? In other words, they're doing this for everybody, a simple one. So like, right, they record the assignment on the chalkboard in the same place every day, or they encourage the students to record a note in an assignment book every single day before they leave the class, right? That's an accommodation that you might use for a kid with ADHD. See, I guess I'm throwing out examples anyhow, right?
It's okay.
But no, I mean, I'm doing that on purpose, obviously. But that idea that a teacher is encouraging the entire class to take a moment of time before the bell rings to write down their homework assignment would be very supportive of a child with ADHD, right? So they're using that for the whole class. And for that reason, that child may be doing just fine. But if they're not, we still have that as part of the information of what this teacher is already doing for the whole class. Then they may be doing things for a certain group of a small group of students. So for example, while they're encouraging the students to write their assignment down for tonight's homework, they're also circulating the room to make sure that 5 kids definitely did it, right? So that might be a whole group / small group accommodation. And then it may come down to, for Billy, the student that I'm there to say, for some reason, they're still not getting their assignment done. Maybe we decide then to give an individualized accommodation that may be to email a copy of the assignment to the child's parent. That's an individualized one, right? So we have 3 tiers of support going on there: whole group, small group, and individual. Okay, now we now have devised a system to support the individual child that's just right in that room. Maybe down the hall, the teacher has all the assignments already put into some kind of an online system where the kid can access it on their own and it's working just fine for them. Okay, well, then we don't change anything in that teacher's room because it's individualized based on where the child is demonstrating need. So the first step in terms of the action sequence that I would suggest is get to know the teacher and the things that they're doing. Secondly, then we work with that teacher to put things in place that fit in their classroom. Because the teacher already had time set aside to record assignments and they were already circulating the room, we had two pieces that we could work from, and then we could just add a third one onto it because we knew what was going on in that teacher's classroom. And then the third step that I would say to that is to empower them with the ability to select their own accommodations. Honestly, I remember it like it was yesterday. My second and third year of teaching, which was back in the 90s, as you did math earlier, I remember walking out almost every single day, having one of my teacher colleagues kind of corner me and say, "Hey, what can we do with Billy in my classroom?" And I would say, "Hey, let me get back to you on that." And then I'd go home and I'd think about it. The next day I'd come in and I would probably give them an accommodation that I reused from somewhere else. I mean, that's just a reality. And it didn't really fit their room. And they just kind of were like, well, because they weren't involved and they weren't engaged in selecting it, then they, of course, expected me to do it because it was my idea. So I'm encouraging special education teachers to kind of flip that script a little bit to engage gen ed teachers in selecting their own accommodations. So in other words, giving them many ideas to say which of these might work in your room drastically increases the chances that that gen ed teacher will become not only involved in selecting, but very engaged in implementing them as well, because they have some investment on the front side. So the third part I would say is to encourage a collaborative environment where the teacher realizes that they have a role and a voice in selecting that accommodation. And then, of course, the cool part about that is when it comes time for the IEP meeting, it's not just a token participation then. They literally are coming to say, well, in my room, I would like to use this accommodation because I think it will really help, Billy in my class. So I think that's kind of a rough outline, I guess you can say, of an action plan that I would follow to engage a general education teacher in selecting an accommodation.
Yeah, I like that, and kind of breaking it down into those tiers so that, like, let's work smarter, not harder. And I think that it is important not to necessarily have the same accommodation for every single kid, but taking a time just to step back and look at what they need in each environment, because it is so common that, especially when they get older and they start moving classroom to classroom, which around here is in fourth grade, each classroom has its own expectations, vibes, way that they do things. And so not only trying to teach them those transitions, but trying to teach them how to manage themselves and their coursework and everything in those different environments is so important. And so taking the time to be reflective as an educator, and provide those accommodations, but also collaborating with that general ed teacher to where they have say-so in it too is very powerful.
Dawn, you mentioned something there that's really important. That is that idea of engaging the child as well. And of course, the older they become, the more likely they are to be able to become engaged in selecting an accommodation, and the supports that will work in their classroom. I always like to add a piece in, and I kind of neglected this earlier, so maybe a good time to throw it out. Yeah. That when we talk about the purpose of an accommodation, we need to know when they're necessary. And I like to use the word engaged as that way of knowing. So we say accommodations are necessary when the child is not engaged in class, instruction, or assessment in a meaningful way. It's a really good way of saying, how do I know when an accommodation is necessary? Well, are they engaged in class? Are they engaged in instruction? In other words, when we're doing practice activities or whatever, or are they engaged in an assessment in a meaningful way? If the answer to any of those is no, then we know that an accommodation or modification may be necessary because they're not engaged in class instruction or assessment in a meaningful way. So, as we talk about the students, The key to that is engaged. And it's interesting because engaged can be either a high or a low type of a thing. In other words, I may be doing too little to support the child. So for that reason, they're not engaged in class instruction assessment. And at the same time, I may be doing too much, which is causing them to not be engaged in class instruction. In other words, I don't need to try because my special education teacher is making it easy for me. Well, in both cases, that leads to disengagement. So as we pay attention to that important statement of engaged in class instruction and assessment in a meaningful way, we need to be aware that it might be because it's too much support or too little support, right? Goldilocks, just right.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of focus on that for just a second. So if you do find that it is too much support, what are your recommendations for general ed teachers and special educators to help fade those prompts? Because I feel like as special educators, we talk about that so much, like fade the prompts, don't do as more than is necessary, like provide just enough. What does that look like? And
yeah, really good question. And I have to back up and give some props to some of my early colleagues when I was a young special education teacher. Obviously my goal was to see my kids doing well, right? Like they're not in class and they're not struggling and they're not crying and everything was going okay. But boy, sometimes when I was trying to do that, I definitely was providing too much support. And my colleagues, my gen ed colleagues called me out on that. They said, "Hey, Tim, I think so-and-so can do more than what they're currently doing, or I think you're doing too much for this kid." And I honestly remember to this day, I just got chills over it. I honestly can remember to this day being offended by that, being upset about that. And now, as a 25-year veteran, I realized that what I should have been doing was realizing that that colleague was saying, I'm not providing just right. I'm doing too much for these kids. Now, fading the prompt, honestly, back to Accommodations, our system that has hundreds of accommodations. One of the things that we tried to do is provide a range. So in other words, you can literally look at a list of, let's say, 10 accommodations that are designed for a child with ADHD maybe, and see where one is definitively providing more support than the other. So sometimes it's about fading. In other words, doing it with less time or less intensity or whatever. But sometimes it might also be about just changing the accommodation. Because I'll give you a quick example. One that just pops in my head. It's not related to the ADHD thing, but it popped into my head, so I'm going to use it. When we talk about like a reading fluency thing, where a child's reading at a given reading level, and we talk about reading the test to the student, right? So because their reading fluency is so low, we start to read the test to the kid. Well, what if the kid is not that low of reading fluency, but they just need maybe some vocabulary words explained to them instead? Like make sure that they can ask questions about the words that they need to know. Or maybe the kid is okay with identifying those unknown words and they just need a little extra time, extended testing time, right? See, that's a range from very intensive, where I read everything to the kid, to least intensive, where I just give them extra time. By thinking about that just right, we can realize, well, if I'm reading the test to the kid and they can read it for themselves, they just need more time. Well, I'm definitely doing too much to support this kid. Back it down to a less intensive accommodation. So yes, there's fading, and then there's also just selecting a less intensive accommodation.
Yeah. So you're tell us a little bit more about your program and how that can help save teachers time in creating a system that is effective and efficient in providing the accommodations. Because I feel like, yeah, you can fade or you can just tweak to find something else. So tell us a little bit more about that and where they can find it.
So the way Accommodations works is there's 3 different ways to find the perfect accommodation. We call them Builder, Browser, and Search. And Builder is designed with your general education teachers in mind, because what they do is they go in and they put check marks in front of strengths and needs that are listed in the system. So they might check, that the student enjoys working with peers and that they don't mind being corrected and like all these different strengths. And then they also select needs. So since you mentioned ADHD earlier, and I mentioned reading fluency, they may check those two needs. Then what happens is the system dives in and sorts through hundreds of accommodations and brings forward only the ones that are appropriate based on the cross-section of those strengths and needs that you selected. Sounds a little complex, but it really works very simple by putting check marks in front of things. And the idea there is a gen ed teacher literally could do that. This is what I see the kid doing in my room strength-wise, and these are the needs I see the child struggling with in my classroom needs-wise. And then it puts forward the list of accommodations, and they're organized into 4 categories: behavior, curriculum, learning, and assessing. So the idea there is we then hone down further to say, well, where does this need seem to pop itself up at? Well, only during instruction. So we look at the instructional part, or only during testing. So we look at testing accommodations. And then all the teacher does then is just clicks on accommodation, and they're then given a blueprint that helps them to understand the accommodation, to click on it to learn more about it in terms of ways to implement it, and then also resources that are maybe would be helpful to the teacher to help them to be able to implement it in a classroom. So maybe it's something as simple as a place to go print off a grid for a graph paper, right? Any resources that would help the teacher to implement it are then available there. Special education teachers tend to like the browser version, which basically all you do is you go in and select the need, and it gives you all the accommodations that are aligned to that need. But there again, the idea is by looking at the range of them that are present there, I all of a sudden now have literally in 5 seconds a list of accommodations that are perfect for ADHD. In 2 or 3 more minutes, I can click on a couple and learn about them and find the one that's just right. So it is designed because when we did our research to find out why general and special education teachers weren't selecting different accommodations, it boiled down to either not knowing, like in the case of a gen ed teacher, or not having the time in the case of a special ed teacher to research and find new ones. So it's designed to be very efficient. And again, I described it, but you can watch a video on our website at actiondriveneducation.com.
Awesome. Well, we will definitely link that in the show notes, and anything else that you mentioned that you want to, as we talk about the accommodations, modifications, and creating that inclusive environment. I think one of the most powerful things is that you said was like, just right isn't just right for everyone. And so that is the perfect like culmination of like why we need accommodations and also modification. So looking at the child individually, but making sure we're not over supporting. And so I'll definitely check it out too. But I've really enjoyed just learning and chatting with you today about this topic and learning about your program that you have. Is there anything else or anywhere else you want to share with our listeners of where they can find and connect with you as we kind of close up the show?
Sure. Our main place is obviously our website, actiondriveneducation.com. If you like some of the topics that we talked about on our blog post, our website has a blog on it. Almost every one of these practices that we talked about are there. And I want to point out the purpose and the name of the company, Action Driven Education. We don't want to just talk about theory. We want to bring this down to actually actions, things people can do. So in our blog, the actions are listed there that might go along with this strategy or this idea. We also have some professional development that's there. One of them we call the Tools for Effective Inclusion. I'm really, really proud of that because that's the type of thing that gen ed teachers, when they get their heads around why these tools, accommodations, and modifications matter so much, what they're for, it's just amazing how it changes things for these students. Of course, we're on Facebook and Instagram and all that kind of stuff as well, but you can find all that off our website. So
perfect. Well, we'll link all that in the show notes too, including the blog, because I do feel like it kind of sparks more questions, or like maybe I do need to check out and refine some of these skills, especially over the summer. So we'll link all that out. But Timothy, I really enjoyed chatting with you today and learning from you. So thank you for taking time to educate us today and to have these action steps to be even better in the classroom.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank everybody for what they do to empower that effective education for students. I tell you what, it's awesome. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.